Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. First, a word from the sponsor of the Compliance Podcast Network for this month, Ethico.
If you're a compliance officer, middle managers are crucial in getting your programs from you to your frontline employees. But how do we activate those managers and get them on our side? Ethico's new Middle Manager Toolkit equips you with the skills needed to empower your managers, to promote a culture where ethical behavior thrives and employees feel empowered to speak up. Learn how to turn frontline managers into ethical leaders with our new white paper, Empowering Middle Managers as Ethics Champions. And did I mention you can get the whole toolkit for free? Head to ethico.com to download the full toolkit today.
10 for 10 for the week ending February 8th, 2025. Our first story, or rather two stories, are about betting, gambling in Major League Baseball. The first one comes to us from the New York Times, or rather The Athletic, which is now the sports section of the New York Times, and it concerns former Commissioner Fay Vincent, who recently passed away. And Vincent's final warning to Major League Baseball was that gambling always leads to corruption, and it doesn't matter what the penalties are or what the guardrails sports put in place, that it will always lead to corruption. And indeed, he went on to say the biggest development in the history of modern history of baseball was not Jackie Robinson, although he was monumentally important. Even more importantly, and sadly and tragically for all American culture, is the legalization of betting on sports. The gambling infestation, which is really the right word of our culture, is a tragic one and is done by a mistake, a drafting error of legislation, and there we go. Now this pairs with a story from MLB that Major League umpire Pat Hoberg was fired for sharing his betting accounts with a non-baseball related third party. He failed to uphold the integrity of the game, and he should have known that his friend, a professional poker player, had bet on baseball from the shared account. Hoberg appealed this finding up, and it was eventually upheld. So we have a Major League Baseball umpire being held to a very high standard of personal conduct, and that he was fired for the appearance of impropriety. So definitely difficult times for MLB. From Bloomberg, we go across the pond to look at Trafigura and its former COO, Mike Wainwright, who were both convicted in a Swiss court of bribery. Wainwright was sentenced to 32 months, 20 of which were suspended. Switzerland's a key hub for the commodity trading sector, and it's long been under pressure to prove it can be tough on an industry that historically has operated with a light regulatory touch. Well, that light regulatory touch allowed or facilitated bribery and corruption in Glencore, Vitol, and now Trafigura. From TV station 12W Boy in West Virginia, it notes that West Virginia is getting rid of DEI from state-funded programs and starting a division called Division of Campus Engagement and Compliance. So it's a reframing of DEI. Now, all of this came out before Attorney General Pam Bondi said that the Department of Justice will criminalize any person, university, or business that considers DEI as a part of its strategy. So it's unknown whether this will hold true for compliance or not. And finally, from Reuters, Mayor Eric Adams is in discussions with the DOJ about dropping his corruption case. Gee, I wonder how that could have happened. Well, if they drop this case, it's going to be interesting to see if the DOJ will ever prosecute another corruption case going forward under this Trump administration. Next, we have several stories relating to the new Attorney General, Pam Bondi. So the first is reported by Bloomberg that Pam Bondi was confirmed as the Attorney General under the Trump administration, and she quickly moved to reshape the Department of Justice's under her watch. She created a weaponized working group to investigate probes of Trump's alleged criminal action by Special Counsel Jack Smith, Alvin Bragg, and New York Attorney General Letitia James. She also called for a pause in federal funding on sanctuary cities, and then we'll go after them as well. As Matt Kelly over at Radical Compliance noted, that she released a memo which retreats on FCPA in investigation and prosecution, and saying that it will only be utilized in cases that involve foreign officials to facilitate human smuggling and trafficking of narcotics and firearms. But she also noted that she was taking away from Maine Justice the sole right to bring FCPA cases, and this will now evolve to the U.S. Attorney's offices literally across America. This is something they have been wanting for the last 20 years. She also indicated that the Department of Justice will not only investigate, but will criminally prosecute those businesses, universities, and individuals who advocate or use DEI. Obviously, by advocating DEI, that's speech, and that's protected speech. And apparently Bondi believes that her criminal prosecutions will trump the First Amendment for those who want to call out against discrimination going forward. So that's going to be a very interesting dynamic in the courts. And it really leads me to a very interesting issue that the NFL may have to look at. As reported by Bloomberg, the Rooney Rule still exists. For those of you who don't know what the Rooney Rule is, the Rooney Rule says that if an NFL team wants to hire a head coach, they have to interview minority candidates and giving them a chance to get a foot in the door to at least interview. Is that a DEI action? Is that a discrimination action against white people? Under the new interpretation of the Department of Justice, certainly appears it could be investigated and perhaps even criminally prosecuted, because after all, you're giving an advantage to someone to be interviewed because they're a minority. So it's unclear whether the DOJ will go after the NFL. Next up from the Wall Street Journal, the top crypto litigator has been reassigned internally. What's his new job? Well, he's migrated or perhaps even matriculated over to the IT department. How's that for you? You're a top litigator for the SEC, and now you're over in IT. Well, what does that tell you about the... And finally, as reported by Reuters, the UK retailing giant Shein, who is trying to go public through an IPO, may be under stakeholder investigation for their alleged use of forced labor, or at least forced labor to drive down their prices. A group wants to have the UK Financial or FCA investigate Shein for its low prices and substandard wages paid by its subcontractors. For 10 is a special production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, our network sponsor is Ethico, and they've got a great new service offering for you, a middle manager's toolkit. We've linked to it in the show notes, and it's available to you at no cost. Many companies struggle with getting information to middle managers, which allows them to be the first line of response in a speak-up culture. And Ethisphere has answered this challenge by putting together a middle manager's toolkit. Check it out in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you'll check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency.